basically deliberately cutting short life.
Okay.
So it's not, well, we might get into that, but it's basically deliberately doing something that's going to end a life by giving something or taking something. Personally, I think it's one of the simpler teachings of the Church, because it really falls under that general commandment, which we all understand, of just not taking another life. Essentially, we be a Christian or non-Christian. I don't think that will be helpful, because it puts at risk the most vulnerable people in society, and it basically starts to say that some lives have more worth than others. And really, when you get the most vulnerable people, that's when the mark of a society is the way it treats its vulnerable people, not how you sort of dispose of them. Well, the Church's, I guess, opinion per se really has not changed on the issue. Christianity is built very much on the Jewish faith, and so the Jewish faith goes back 5,000 years or so, and so we trace it right back to, if you want to trace it to the commandment, you shall not kill. But even beyond the commandment, you shall not kill, and built upon that is just that innate sense in every human person, which we just sort of call a natural law within them, that to take another's life is not a good thing to do. Well, the Church's teaching on euthanasia, there are when you get a teaching as fundamental as not taking someone's life, you'd probably appreciate there's no need to issue a 40-page dossier on that, because that's that basic teaching, not take life. But in that being said, right throughout the Church's history, there's been teachings and documents, and there's something like the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which pulls all the Church's teachings together. That'll state quite clearly about that euthanasia is the taking of deliberate taking of life. It doesn't fit in with the idea to respect and cherish all life. So there are documents all along the way you could find. For me personally, the reason I work in this agency and work in the Church is because I actually believe, not just because I was told, because I think from reason and logic that the Church's teachings make sense. It really developed in the very beginning, understanding that life is good, so euthanasia is just built onto that. I guess you could take another example. When did I develop an opinion that it was good to eat fruit? It's something that's just built on your understanding of what it is to be human. So it's just an extension of that. I think the Church's teaching on euthanasia and many moral topics is very misunderstood by people. People tend to understand, they know what the rules are often. The Church says don't do this, the Church says don't do that. But what is lacking in social commentary, be it in the media or be it just in general conversation, is really the reasons why. I think what we have in society is a conflicting understanding of what the human person is. So if you believe the human person is just a soulless being that once this life ends dies and goes in the grave and that's it, then in a sense euthanasia does make sense, because why suffer? What merit could suffering possibly have? And therefore I'd say, euthanize those who wish. But if you believe that human life is more than just the sum of our bodily parts, if you believe that, you look at the human being, he dreams, she desires, thinks, reasons, loves. These are all traits not of just an animal. These are traits, we might call them spiritual traits, of something bigger than ourselves. So when we look at a human being, we can sort of say, well, the human is more than just a body, we're not just an animal. And when we realise we're not just a body and there's something bigger, we can sort of say, well, is life more than just now? And if you believe that life does have more than just, this particular 70, 80 years we're in, then you can sort of start to ask the questions, well, is it good to just take life? Does suffering have a reason, have a purpose, have a value? And that's what the Church would teach, that although suffering, you might get onto it, is not a good. No one wants to suffer, and we're not encouraging people to suffer. The Church is not saying, in regards to euthanasia, that everyone should live as long as they possibly can, and we should keep on giving them drugs and keep them on life support. And I think that's what people think the Church teaches. What the Church teaches is that euthanasia is basically deliberately killing somebody. The doctor says to you, well, you've got cancer, and you may be 50, 60, 70 years old. There's these cancer-treating drugs you can take, and if you take them, it might give you 6, 8, 10, 12 months. You can very legitimately choose to take them or not to take them.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to take life-extending treatments, but it's very different to say, well, instead, we're going to kill you. It's like if I use the example that my grandmother's died, but if I said, well, Grandma, she's going to die in 6 months. I can either take a gun and shoot her in the head, and she'll die immediately, or I can just wait the natural causes out and she'll die. Same result, dead grandmother at the end. Very different how you've reached that goal, and I guess that's what the church is saying. You can't just reach a goal without sort of questioning how you get there. Our definition of dignity, and indeed the human person, is tied in, like I said, with this idea that the human person is a spiritual being and not just an animal. So you'll note that if we have a sick dog or a sick cat, we'll euthanize and put them down, as you say, put them out of their misery. And that's fine because they are just an animal, there's nothing more to them. But the dignity of a human person extends beyond that, because we would say in the Christian tradition they're created in the image and likeness of God, that every human person, no matter who they are, be it a drug-addicted porn star or be it the greatest person on the planet virtue-wise, they all have the same worth, they're all good people, and they all have this dignity that's given to them in virtue that they're created in God's image. But dignity is not something you can earn, like, finishing the HSC or getting a driver's license. You can't lose it and you can't get it by society. It's always there.
Mm-hmm.
And so our understanding of dignity is that your dignity is just by the fact that you exist as a human person. So the person in a vegetative state or the disabled child still has dignity. And people who say, well, it's all about dignity in this life, they sort of tend to go down a slippery slope, because what does happen to the disabled baby or the person who is in a vegetative state? Are we just saying all those people should be knocked off completely? And are we saying that really the only worth humans have is when they're between the ages of 20 and 60 and can be, good members of the working society? Is that the society we want, a very eugenic society where we make up people that we think are good people? Or is society the real plethora of black, white, yellow, red, poor, elderly, handicapped? Is that the society we sort of encompass? I guess the church's view is that euthanasia falls very much into the murder category, because if we question what is murder, murder is understood by everyone on the street out there. Murder is taking another's life. We'd say euthanasia is doing the same thing, but what's happening in the pro-euthanasia camp is they're setting up reasons that make murder okay. Well, you're sick, you're elderly, you have no family, therefore it's okay to murder you. But it becomes very arbitrary, because who makes these decisions? So I'd sort of put them in the same camp. I have not directly been involved in a euthanasia situation. I can talk about one situation that comes to mind, which I think stems... I think it's very much in the idea of how we view the human person. My grandmother, she died a few years ago, as I mentioned. She had dementia, so she couldn't remember anything, couldn't remember who she was, who her family was, etc. That went on for a couple of years. She was in a nursing home and then passed away eventually. But I remember once a family friend came in, and her name was Geeta, and he said, well, it's a good thing that Geeta's gone now, because in a sense she was living this terrible life. So this good family friend had really had this idea in his head that Geeta's life only really was her life when she could remember things, when she was sort of active, when she was about. So to him, he had this real idea that the human person is only really a human person when they sort of can make rational choices. So it was I found it an interesting perspective, because I think that's what a lot of people might think out there, that a human person is only a human person when they can sort of do stuff. And you get, at the other end of the spectrum, you can come down to the abortion debate, which I think for some people is more complex, but it hinges on that same idea that life is life from conception to natural death. And if we start picking and choosing moments that, well, we don't want this child, we don't want this elderly person, we can think of 1,000 excuses for things. But the church is really, if she's anything, she's the great advocate for life. The church loves life, loves marriage, loves family, and thinks we don't have the right to sort of play God about those things. think the reason a lot of people, and sort of studies show too, that the reason a lot of people seek euthanasia is that they don't want to feel like they're a burden on society, a burden on their family, a burden on their friends. Yeah. And you can understand that. No one likes to be a burden. But what society needs is to basically support these people. So often you find, you probably heard of palliative care, so care of those who are dying, basically to sort of comfort them, and they're not trying to recover, but we're just trying to look after their last days. You sort of find that when good palliative care is made available to people, and support is there, often the need and the desire for euthanasia drops, because at the end of the day, people like life, people like living, and if you even look at people who we might consider have a lower quality of life, they're missing a limb, they're missing an arm. If you talk to some of those people and you sort of read their sort of stories, they're some of the most inspirational people, because they really understand that life is a great good. So I'd be happy to, talk to anybody, but if someone came to me and said, yes, I'm thinking about having euthanasia, it's not really a matter of just saying, oh, this is how you do it. What we need to do is say to that person, well, what's put you in this position? Why have you got to that? People call Lifeline because at the end of the tether. Well, what Lifeline tries to do is sort of say, well, where are you at? Why have you got to that point? So the church is more for finding solutions, not just sort of executing the quickest possible option.
Yeah.
It's a continual push around the States if you sort of follow what's happening.
Yeah.
I think society's got to such a point that, you see with the same-sex marriage legislation, people really, we would contest, misunderstand what marriage is now, they misunderstand what the human person is. So, I think it could quite be possible that euthanasia legislation comes in for the simple reason that people have really fallen into a great amnesia about what it is to be human and what it is to live, and they've taken on a very, very secular mindset. I know we live in a society, which is fine, the church is pro-separation of church and state, each one has its own particular tasks, but what people have forgotten is in throwing out Christianity, they throw out a lot of good ideals. So the idea of, helping one's neighbour, of charity, those are Christian ideals. You don't just pick up those in a secular society. So what we sort of see now is with the direct removal of Christian ideas by sort of an atheistic minority often, is all those little Christian ideals about the good of the person, the good of life, they dissipate too. So I wouldn't be surprised if that legislation came in time. Terry Shiver, you probably heard of her in the States. She was a regular woman who had a car accident and went into a vegetative state. And her husband and the husband's family, the husband pushed quite strongly for her to be euthanized because she wasn't getting any better. She'd been in this state for quite a while. And Terry's family was pushing for her to be saved, obviously. What happened in the end was it became sort of state-sanctioned legislation. They removed water and food from her, and she starved to death. It was a very, very public case, the Terry Shiver case, and it was quite a horrific case because this woman, basically the judge said that she should starve to death effectively, and she did, right, in the realm of all the media. It was a very sad case, and at that same time there was some discussion about whether or not one could remove legitimately water and basically basic water and food provisions from someone in a vegetative state as a considered euthanasia. And there was a big science. The church is very involved in science. She has been for 2,000 years, contrary to what popular belief is. And so there's always an annual scientific convention that happens at the Vatican. And there was a discussion about this idea of water and food hydration, whether that should be, whether that was permissible in some cases. And I know the debate was going on, and at one point the Holy Father Pope came out himself and he made it very clear, and that was backed up then by the conference as well, and in the way they discussed it, that it's always necessary to hydrate someone. You can't withdraw water and food at any point. Even someone in a prolonged vegetative state, the most basic human need is water and food. So it might be the case that someone who's dying takes less and less and less, which is obviously part of the reason they die, but to deliberately withdraw water and food is a very basic human treatment.
Yeah.
Most of the church's teachings, they really come back to how you view the human person, and the church has a very specific view for the human person as someone in body and soul created in God's image. And when you have that understanding, and I think you understand the foundation, a lot of her teachings make a lot more sense. I think what is promoted in the culture has to be carefully watched because if there's no guard in the culture, if everyone can just create their own version of the human person, and there's 100,000 versions of what's right and wrong. So we do need to actually sometimes step back from what the popular mindset is and say, well, actually, is that good? I mean, if a society starts to treat its vulnerable and its elderly as not commodities, well, as basically things to be gotten rid of, then really is it a society that's going to be around for very long? So I'd say, yeah, a lot of what we have to say comes down to who you believe the person is.